Hi all, welcome back. I hope the first week was an interesting and productive one for you, and I look forward this week to really getting into some of the content of the course for the summer. I wanted to give you a brief overview of the first piece of reading that you're going to be studying, which is a selection from a book called A Secular Age by Charles Taylor. I have my copy of it here. You can see that it's a fairly large book. It runs about 500 and, I take that back, it runs 900 pages. I thought maybe you wouldn't want to read all of it, so I've chosen what I think is the most relevant for us. To give you a sense of what Taylor is doing in this book, he is asking the question, why is it that 500 years ago, everyone believed in God, everyone believed in supernatural forces in the universe, and why is it that now, only 500 years later, that is not something that we can assume? There are an awful lot of people who don't believe in God or supernatural forces. So that's one question Taylor is asking. The other question that he's asking is, how did that change come about? In order to understand what Taylor is saying in his book, you've got to understand kind of three basic points that he covers in the introductory material. And I'm going to run through those very quickly for you, just so that you know what's going on with this. He talks about three key features of the medieval world, and that's the world 500 years ago. First, he says, people back then saw God in the natural world, not just in like a flower as evidence of God's existence. They really understood that the bad things that happen in the world are things that are caused by spirits out there, whether God or demons or other types of supernatural beings. So last week, for instance, we had these awful tornadoes in Oklahoma. It wasn't Oklahoma City, but it was in Oklahoma. We look at that and we look for a scientific explanation of why those tornadoes happened. 500 years ago, Taylor says, people would have assumed that a god or a spirit was causing that to happen for some reason. So people 500 years ago saw God and the supernatural in nature. Second, Taylor says, 500 years ago, the very structure of society was based on the idea of God. Kings ruled because God gave them permission to. We tend not to think about that anymore. We don't look at the president and say, oh, the president has been ordained by God, has been appointed by God to be our leader. It's a person that we have chosen. 500 years ago, God was woven into the fabric of society, in government and in all kinds of other ways. So that's the second key feature of a medieval worldview that Taylor is describing. The third is that he says people lived in an enchanted world, and this is similar to the point earlier. But the idea here is that people just assumed the existence of God, of spirits, of supernatural beings in a way that we no longer do. That's not to say that you might not believe in supernatural beings, but we can't assume that all people do, because there are other explanations for the way that the world works. So those are the three parts of the medieval world that Taylor is really focused on. The section that you're reading builds on that, and in this section, Taylor is going to describe how things are now, and crucially, he's going to start to discuss how they have become different from what they were 500 years ago. This is going to be a really important part of the course, the reading for this particular section. Let me try to give you two reasons why I think this is a particularly important piece of reading for us this summer. First, as I've suggested, we don't assume anymore that evil is always a supernatural force. It's just one of the ways in which we speak of evil. We do hear talk about demons, we do hear talk about other kinds of supernatural forces, but there are other ways of talking about evil that we are familiar with. We reviewed some of those in the introduction to the course last week. So that's one reason, is that this gives us some sense of how it is that we have come to think about evil in multiple ways, rather than just as a demon causing it. Second, Taylor provides us a philosophical grounding for what we mean when we say that evil is supernatural, which is going to be the focus of this particular unit. So with that background in mind, it's time to turn your attention to the reading for this unit, 12 pages from A Secular Age. It's not especially easy reading. I'll warn you ahead of time. You're going to need to take your time with this, to work through it carefully, to pay attention to the way in which Charles Taylor lays out his argument. There will be a brief quiz on it. You can have your book open. It's just kind of a pointing you in the right directions kind of quiz. And then we will take this work and apply it, or try to apply it, to a poem written back when we were in what Taylor calls an enchanted world. That poem is Beowulf. Some of you may have read it. Even if you have, I hope that you come to it with a little bit of a different perspective this particular time through, after having read Charles Taylor's A Secular Age, or the portions from it. As always, feel free to get in touch with me if things are confusing or if you have additional questions. Otherwise, I look forward to hearing what you have to say about Taylor and about Beowulf.